Tonight's discussion is entitled The Trouble with Curating and will be moderated by Dr. Andrew Renton. Andrew is a distinguished writer and critic and the director of curating at Goldsmiths College. And he will introduce the other four panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David, and apologies for a bit of a late start. Some of you may have noticed that there's a revolution going on outside. Forgive me, I'm not going to get political, but it's kind of amazing that you're all here. You're all here because you're interested in a discourse about ideas and about things that you feel passionately about, and I kind of think it's extraordinary that just a few yards down the road, some of those possibilities are being taken away from us. So I think we should sort of spare a thought for tens of thousands of people who are outside as we speak, and many of you I know have been there today. What we're talking about, I think it does ultimately connect to all of that, but I think we'll try to understand what that is in due course. My job is really just to chair this, because I have such an illustrious panel around me, and I shall introduce you. I did try to alphabetize this, and then I realized that somehow my sense of what the alphabet is somewhat different from anyway, so in order of appearance on my pieces of paper, Penelope Curtis, who has heroically managed to get here from Tate, Britain. She was curator at the Henry Moore Institute from 1999, and I think many of us would recognize that she developed one of the most distinctive programs in the country, and now as director of Tate Britain is really involved in the front line of what we think of in terms of curating in this country. She's been she previously had worked also at Tate Liverpool from its inception in 1988, and has been involved in all levels of curatorial and research around contemporary art, and it's, you know, she's a great ally and a great advocate for contemporary practice in this country. Emily Pethick is director of the Showroom, and she oversaw the dramatic and I think really exciting move of the Showroom from the east of London to the west of London, and she deserves a very long holiday for the stresses that she went through to doing that. Previously, she was director of Casco, Office for Art, Design and Theory in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Before that, she was curator at Cubit back in London. She's involved in Publish and Be Damned, the really innovative self-publishing sort of initiative, and you know, is a well-known and established writer in many magazines and journals. Steven Claydon, at the end of the row, is an artist, a musician, and for me, actually, one of my favorite curators. As an artist, you know, he's shown in many exhibitions, and Tate Modern in Switzerland and New York, the Kunstverein in Düsseldorf, Porticus in Frankfurt, and as a curator, curated a really truly extraordinary show in 2007 at Camden Art Centre called "Strange Events Permit Themselves the Luxury of Occurring." I kind of think that might be one of the phrases for the evening. Steven was also a member of a great band called Add N to X, no longer, sadly, not with us, or
no longer extant.
No longer extant, but you know, as is the nature of these things, there will be a sort of Take That style revival, I suspect. I hope, and you can see just how successful they have become. 10 years on. 2005, he made a cameo appearance. I did not know this, but he made a cameo appearance in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire as a member of the band The Weird Sisters. Is that true?
Unfortunately.
Okay, that's fantastic to know. It's amazing what you can turn up when you do a bit of homework. Pavel Buchler, on my immediate left, is nothing short of a legendary artist and writer and lecturer. Born in the Czech Republic, but he's been living here since 1981. Is that right? That's what my...
Born in Czechoslovakia.
Yes. Forgive me. Yes, born in Czechoslovakia. And his list of exhibitions is really, really substantial. He's also been involved in curating, curated a very significant show in 2005 with Charles Escher, Whatever Happened to Social Democracy. That was at the Museum in Malmo. He's participated in many shows, the Istanbul Biennial, he's done National Gallery of Prague, he's been involved in Frieze projects, Shanghai Art Gallery, Luc Tuymans' curated show in Belgium this year, solo exhibitions in Kunsthal Bern, Van Abbe Museum at Eindhoven, Mucha, Antwerp, etc., etc. And there was a monograph, a really substantial monograph on his work published, I think, about 3 years ago. So this is the framing of the personalities involved today. 2 artists, 2 curators, in fact 4 curators, of whom 2 are artists. And we have to ask this kind of, we're here to ask this question, the trouble with curating. About 2 years ago, my students did a book of which the graphic of the book was a sort of zigzag red line on the front of the book. And that, they told me, was that little line, the line that you get on Microsoft Word when the word is spelt wrong. Turns out that curating was not a word, even in 2008. The good news is, or maybe indeed the bad news is, that in the new Microsoft Word program from 2010, it seems that curating now is a word, and you might want to check that out. But just as an exercise, I just kind of started looking around. You put the word curating into your Google search, and it turns out that there's a little bit too much curating going on in the world. And there's a lot of things that are done in the name of curating. I was amused to read that Ray Davis, who is curating Meltdown on the South Bank, said, "Curating Meltdown, it's like buying a bag of sweets." We've had curating architecture, we've had curating design. I noticed there was a thing on curating immateriality. Most importantly, there was a vicar who has started a blog and has written a book called Curating Worship. The Wigan Leisure and Culture Trust are curating in the community. There is, of course, critical curating. The ICA had an event called Extreme Curating. I noticed someone also had been developing a project called Curating the Farm, curating in the countryside. That's quite nice. Other civic councils are curating intangible cultural heritage. I noticed a project called Curating Human Origins in the 20th Century Tanzania, curating the high street. Someone is curating emails. There's a very interesting sort of new use of the word curating in science and research projects. Cosmic, curating the cancer variome, curating the innate immunity interactome. A description of the project. We describe the innate DB curation project, which is manually annotating the human and mouse innate immunity interactome in rich contextual detail, etc., etc. Brand curating. Twitter starts curating trending topic tweets, classifying, culturing, and curating microbes. There you go, curating microbes. That's how far it's gone. So curating would seem to be a, linguistically at least, a misappropriated term. It's a term that really has come into currency very, very, very quickly. The dictionaries and the spell checks have taken time to catch up with it. But it would seem to be one of the kind of dominant forces in the contemporary art world. And I run a curatorial program. There were no curatorial programs 15 years ago. I think today a liberal arts institution would be considered incomplete without one. Do we need them? Do we need so many curators? I say that looking into the audience and seeing some of my students here. We need all of them, of course. And we really are at a moment where I sense as a curator where the battle has been fought and won, but the question will be whether this victory was indeed a Pyrrhic victory or not. So the real first question, and it's the simplest question of all, is do we need curators? Maybe that should just be the question. Do we need curators? I'm looking to you guys. Maybe I should look to the artists first. There's a nuance to this, but do we need curators to do
what? I mean, you actually touched on the answer, because in order to even begin to discuss the question, one needs to ask, well, what is the purpose? What is it that the curator brings into the world, or curating brings into the world? What does it change in the world? How do you become a curator? What it means for the world that there is this activity, as we have just heard, rather kind of hard to define, that somehow does something. So the question of the necessity of it or the need for it has to be seen against that background. But what is it that we need them for? To say, do we need curators is somehow not enough. What do you need curators for? That is really the...
What have you needed curators for?
Not to be alone, I suppose. In some kind of way, I am not always sure of my own identity. You sort of described me very eloquently. I don't know who gave you the script, but I could kind of recognize it. I'm not kind of unsure of my own identity, and when immigration officers ask me, oh, you're an artist, because like an idiot, that's what I said in my passport. Never do that. Say curator, much safer, I'm sure. And what kind of artist are you? You can imagine those questions. And I'm never kind of unsure of that identity, because I can say, ever since I sort of, became half aware of the world around me, I kind of had at least some kind of intuitive sense that I wanted to be an artist. But with a curator, imagine, I always wanted to be a curator. Ever since I was a little boy, my mother used to say, go upstairs and curate something. And so it's much less certainty to that sort of identity, and you somehow, like to feel that there is something else next to you, which is much less certain of itself, which supports your kind of self-certainty in the world. So that's what I need curators for.
Okay. Steven, as an artist, have curators got in the way, or have they enabled things to happen?
Well, despite the kind of proximity of the two professions, there's, in a strange way, a kind of, they occupy very sort of discrete and remote areas of the same field. And in a way, you're just happy to know that the curators are doing something, and that you're doing what you do. And then occasionally there's some kind of meeting takes place there, and it's a very sort of peculiar dynamic. But nevertheless, I do see curation as this kind of peculiar relation, and not necessarily like a second cousin rather than a direct relative. And so, for me, I do see the necessity of it, but I also see the absurdity of it, and I think exactly the same thing about being an artist.
When you say you're happy to see the curators doing something, is that sort of a bit like sort of having children in the back of the car and they've got a game to play with to keep them occupied?
No, I mean, when Pavel talked about, like myself, I decided I wanted to be an artist from very early on, and perhaps it's not the same kind of set of expedients, circumstances that sets you on a trajectory to become a curator. However, I'm sure that if somebody's arranging their bubblegum cards or whatever, or deciding that, this is how I want my room, or saying, actually, this isn't how I want to live my life. I don't like the way the world's been arranged around me, and I'd like to rearrange it. I think that could be a similar sort of thing. Either you become a politician or a curator.
But could we imagine a scenario? Could we imagine a curatorless art world? I mean, it needs to be someone. Does there need to be someone mediating this?
I think in the old-fashioned sense of a curator looking after a collection, I think you do need curators. You need people with knowledge of the collections and to pass that on. I guess when you are in Europe, mainland Europe, people don't talk about curating, they talk about making exhibitions.
Yes.
And I think that is, in a way, quite a useful distinction. Curators look after permanent collections and develop permanent collections. And other people, maybe the same people, not always the same people, make exhibitions. And very often the people who are making exhibitions need the curators for the knowledge of the collections. So, I mean, it's boring in a way, but it's just a word that slipped. And I think people like the kind of rather old-fashioned authority that it had and applied it to a different activity altogether.
What, in that case, where is the distinction between the archive and making exhibitions? What happens there?
Well, the archive is a bit like the curator word, isn't it? That it's become very fashionable, and artists love archives at the moment, and the whole idea of the archive has opened up way beyond what an archive really is, just like the curator has. It's a kind of false authority.
And in terms of the archive of archives, in art terms, you've just inherited a collection and a half. And I presume you've been spending the past few months rummaging around in your basement just to see what's there and so on. What do you discover about the collection that sort of impacts on the way that you think about making exhibitions? Because I think presumably you're entering something that was not familiar to you.
I suppose traditionally people made exhibitions if they didn't have things in the collection.
Okay.
And maybe now we're beginning more to make exhibitions from what we do have in the collection.
Right, and you've just made some. You're planning to rethink how Tate Britain will be displayed in relation to the collection.
And maybe a bit more like an exhibition and a bit less like an exhibition. Allow a collection to be more informal in a way and more open, and to do less predictable things, perhaps, than an exhibition might.
Such as?
Well, I guess exhibitions have a set of messages. People who are making shows work out what they want an exhibition to do and say. I think a collection, you can allow it to be much more open.
Or do you have to force it open? Is that one of the things that a curator has to do? That in a certain sense, a collection which accumulates according to a set of priorities that an institution like the Tate over decades accumulated a collection with an agenda or a series of or a sequence of agendas, let's say. Is your job to kind of sort of collapse that or dismantle that and look again?
Yes, I wouldn't say force,
Right.
because it doesn't need to be that hard. It can be easier than you expect. It just needs an opportunity, because I guess collections can acquire a kind of inertia.
Right. But could you put your, maybe it's an unfair question, could you give a specific example of what, of something that you might be tweaking that would be opening this up for us?
I'll think about it if you ask Emily a question.
Yes. Okay. I'm just thinking, I mean, Emily, you run an institution that absolutely is not about collection.
Yeah.
And you have a reputation for, certainly in Casco and in the Showroom, running organisations that are probably, it would be fair to say, more discourse-driven than object-driven.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about, I don't see myself really as a curator because, I mean, well, I mean, that's my background and I have curated a few shows, but a lot of the time I'm producing things.
What's the distinction there?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I would see myself, let's say, the curator of an overall program and the direction of an organisation. I mean, I'm the director of the showroom rather than the curator. But I think a lot of the time I'm really working with artists individually on producing something and working quite closely with them to shape the direction of the way those projects go. I'm shaping the overall direction of the showroom, but it's not really fitting into a kind of like Penelope said, the more conventional notion of a curator as a keeper of a collection, of interpreter of a collection.
But I mean,
we are producing a discourse around what we're doing, so I guess in that sense.
but to take somewhere like the Showroom, which has a 20-plus year history, primarily of one-person shows, showing artists at a very formative moment in their career. So the question is whether one could forensically sort of extrapolate back from the shows that have been there to understand just where the curator was in this equation. Is the dignified role of the curator at that point, is the job to really just stand back until absolutely necessary?
I mean, actually, the showroom's had 4 directors,
Yeah.
and each one has marked quite a strong territory in a way. I mean, you can see the kind of periods of the showroom under. I mean, David was the first director,
Indeed.
David Thorpe. And so, in that sense, it has played a role in shaping certain kinds of directions.
Yes.
I mean, the directions have shaped certain kinds of viewpoints on what was going on at those particular times.
And for you, what is how would you define your obligations to the artist that you want to work with? Is it a role that you play, or is it a set of criteria that you apply, or is it just is it a kind of ethical obligation that you have a particular job to do with the artist?
Well, I think quite often you're working between the artist and, let's say, the audience or the various kinds of stakeholders of the showroom. I think the role is very much about finding ways to help them. I mean, a lot of the work we do is quite... well, each show has its own particular each project has its own kind of particular direction, but some of the work we've done has been rooted in working within our particular context in the neighbourhood, because we've very recently moved there. And in that way, I think what we've done as the showroom is been, in a way, helping the artist to access things that are there that we know about, that we think could be of interest. And so in that sense, it's not forcing anything in any direction, but allowing projects to fulfill as much of the potential they have as possible. And I think that's what I do quite often when I'm working with artists, is kind of try to not steer, but kind of help to allow things to go as far as they can to realise their full potential.
I think you can't really curate an artist.
No, exactly.
I think
That's what I mean.
I think I'm more convinced by curating an institution, so that you might produce one show with one artist and then another. And I think the program and the conversation that you start to build up, that's curation, you could say. I think that works. That, you know, when you've got 3 shows a year or 10 shows a year, and then over 10 years you've got 100 shows. I mean, curation has a lot to do with juxtaposition, isn't it? And how one project responds to the next and how that builds up.
How did you start that process when you when the door opened in your new office? I mean, what did you do when you sat down at your desk? What was the curatorial plan?
Oh, I feel like I'm in my press interview again. What was the curatorial plan?
Well, if you can curate an institution, then that's what you do.
Yes, but I think it's something that begins to happen, and you realise what's happening retrospectively almost.
Right.
And then once you realise the trajectory you're on, you can start to build on it.
Right. So it's responsive. So curating there is a kind of is responsive.
Well, it's also seeing how your audience reacts, how one show responds to another show.
Right.
I guess I'm not at that point yet.
No, early days. We can't judge yet. But
Talking about the idea of the obligation to the to the audience and the obligation to the artist or the obligation to the artwork. I mean, I haven't really got a great deal to say about it except for the fact that where does one take over the other? Why is it important in the first place to have an obligation to the artist at all? Anyway, I mean, I think perhaps that is something that you should have. But why necessarily should curators ever take on that kind of generous nature? Why not just use them as props?
I guess if
Sorry, would you guys turn up a little bit? It's really difficult to hear.
so should we?
Maybe we're
It's
too far away.
loud. It's loud here.
Well, we'll
Maybe come closer.
if we'll sort of just kind of crouch there, maybe in the maybe there's some volume can be sort of turned up.
He's gone.
Is it something I said?
Something you said. But so, what you're questioning the kind of liberal generosity that the curator is invested with in terms of its
Or
his,
maybe not
her
even
relationship
invested with perhaps it's the way they are expected to behave, or a kind of behaviour that's forced upon them. For instance, when I curated a show, I had none of the kind of strictures that are placed upon me that somebody who makes a living out of curation has. And I was very aware of that, and the kind of freedom and also the kind of dangerous territory that I could inhabit. And also, I had no CV to curate. You know, I mean, let's talk about the problems with curation. It's like so many people would tether in or stop themselves from making kind of grand gestures or perhaps interesting decisions because of the pressures of trying to keep your CV or your career intact, because you view the overall complexion of an artist's work, but artists are allowed to be a bit more maverick, perhaps, and a curator.
It is interesting because I think it's one of the points that comes up time and again in our seminars at Goldsmiths when we're talking about it is about the possibilities that seem to be available to the artist who curates, set against, if you like, the curator who curates. It was going to be a question, that was really going to be my next question to both you and Pavel, who both have experiences of curating. Can you talk a little bit about how you organised your Camden show, for example?
Well, I mean, I became very aware immediately of like the vast kind of set of options that were open to me. And I also, was aware that making a kind of top 10 of my favourite artists would be not necessarily interesting to anyone else, and would be kind of predictable probably anyway. And I was mindful of the way a curator might approach a show, and the kind of the liberty that the liberties that I could take in my capacity as a guest curator. And I was trying to think about the way my practice operated, and I think I was trying to think about kind of casual equivalence and the way that one thing might kind of catalyse another, and that I might find myself curating artists into the show that I didn't necessarily even like. I mean,
Right.
I did like, but I had this kind of very peculiar relationship with them, and in terms of like some of the artists I'd been aware of since being quite young, and so there was this idea of casual equivalence of a kind of non-scientific approach that gradually gained some kind of you can force those equivalences and you can create a discourse where there perhaps is none, and so the kind of semi-fictitious nature of it was interesting to me, and that's why I chose to title it after a piece of fiction. So the quote is from Charlie Chan: "Strange events permit themselves the luxury of occurring," and I just wonder why is that? Why would that quote not be as have as much efficacy because it's fictional as it would from some sage philosopher? And so so that was part of what catalysed the series of events that ended up as an exhibition.
And when you worked institutionally, did you find that there were moments where the institution turned, or individuals in the institution turned around and said, oh, gosh, that's interesting? I mean,
No, usually it was
Opposite.
we can't do that.
So what?
No, not really. No, it wasn't necessarily a fight, but you know, you come across all kinds of difficulties, technical, logistical. So I mean, because there was quite a number of artists involved in the show, there was I managed to get most of them in. I mean, no, I don't think anyone ever turned around and said that's interesting.
Well, when I said that's interesting, I was being kind of British about it, meaning that's interesting, meaning that's
I see.
tricky.
Right, okay, yeah. Yeah, no, a lot of it. I mean, there are all these things you have to bear in mind, that the amount of parity between male artists and female artists, all of these things that I'd not necessarily considered. And not necessarily, I mean, in many ways, some of the major works were by female artists, and I was unsure why at some stages I was being encouraged to create some kind of parity there. But I did feel kind of obliged to in many ways. I mean, it was new territory for me, so
Right.
some of it was belligerence and some of it was acquiescence.
But in the end, did you feel the show was primarily about you?
No, I mean, I wanted it to be about the way something comes into being, and in the way that maybe one of my works might come into being, but not about me, because the work that I make isn't based on kind of seduction or things that I might find seductive or aesthetic. It's part of kind of parallel research. I mean, you know, we're always discovering things that we might or might not.
I felt that because your exhibition, in a way, refused to make overt sense, the way to make sense of it was to think it was about you.
Well, I mean, I think that everything that you encounter, unless it has, you know, is completely illustrative, has a kind of oblique nature. And as the viewer, it's your job with anything, in any encounter that you make with anything during the day, is to try to kind of interrogate the set of circumstances and to how a thing or an object comes into being. And I think that's what I want to. That's what I want people to get from my work. It doesn't necessarily have to be an illustrative or a very overt narrative. I think we describe things by the kind of peripatetic satellites of objects around an errand.
Yes.
Kind of.
I liked it. I liked the way that you didn't have to make sense.
Yeah.
Whereas so
Well, I
often,
was allowed not to.
exactly, and so often with exhibitions we have to make, I think, too much sense, so it gets more and more narrowed down.
Yeah, I was aware of that, I suppose when it comes down to it, that is probably the problem with curation.
Get out there. We're done. Pavel, you co-curated a show about 3 years ago with Charles Escher. Curator collaborating with an artist.
Well, a curator collaborating with me. This is the thing. I think, I missed a little bit of the discussion, so maybe the definition kind of popped up while I popped out, as it were. But I'm still not sure that we have that sort of working definition of what we are talking about. And in some kind of way, experience teaches that pretty much everybody I know is a curator. Certainly pretty much everybody you meet at a dinner in Berlin is a curator. Anybody older than 13, but younger than about 27. And we somehow kind of know, I feel it, or the audience somehow, I think, know. If we had a show of hands, I think we could prove it. We know what we are talking about, and we are putting a name on it, but we don't really want to pin down what exactly it is. It's still the first question. What do we need it for? What do we need curating for? Which would somehow clarify what identity we are talking about. In the case of the exhibition that you mentioned, Charles Escher certainly, now he's a director of a big institution, then he was a director of a small institution, but certainly somebody who would probably own up to being a curator. Whether he would actually know, what kind of constitutes the sort of activity, I'm not sure. But he would certainly own up to it. And we got together to put together, as I would prefer to call it, to make an exhibition. Our sort of resources and our different sort of ideas about the exhibition was kind of vaguely about, if it was about anything, a kind of attempt to sort of imagine how art can imagine social democracy. And in some kind of way, the reason for Charles asking me to get involved in that was precisely that I did not need to approach it, if you like, from the kind of point of view of any particular discipline, that is, curating. And the reason why that may have been helpful, maybe not within that project, but helpful as an idea, is that the more we see art, which is somehow, the more we see art which looks like or has the kind of features of pretty much any other sort of human practice but painting or sculpting or whatever we traditionally associate with the artistic identity. The more we see of work which sort of designates other practices as the practices of art, we somehow need to have someone who adjudicates and simply says, no, this is art, not because of any kind of necessity to place it in a cultural sort of hierarchy, but because it helps the viewer or the critic, or it helps us to assume the kind of correct perspective, if you like. We know how to look at it. If there is somebody who says, well, it may look like philosophy, or it may look like sociology, or it may look like anthropology, or it may look like rubbish, but this is the point from which to look at this thing. Yeah? And so in order to do that, it just sometimes seems to me, I corrected you when I said, curator collaborating with me rather than collaborating with an artist, because I was not, even though I did have a piece of work in the show, but I wasn't really, if you like, functioning. I was not wearing my artist's hat. And it seems to me that if we do need the curators, we need this idea of a clear identity and a discipline. That there is something like curating, that it is a discipline, that you can demonstrate what it is, you can name it, and the reason why we need it is that it gives us the kind of perspective or the starting point from which to approach the work, which very often does not appear to fit clearly any kind of disciplinary description. Yeah?
Does that resonate with you?
Well, I guess traditionally...
I'm talking about the kind of curators outside the collection. I totally agree with your sort of distinction between exhibition making and curating in the kind of, traditional sense of the collection curator, yes.
I mean, in a way, it's a framing, it's a way of framing things. And I think in terms of the two small organisations I've been running, one of the things that I guess the curatorial approach might be is to build up a kind of context in which... Sorry? Oh, right, am I not? It's about building up a conversation or a context within which you can invite people into to kind of take that forward or contribute, but without kind of, without forcing anything and without limiting things.
That's the bit that worries me a lot, is this process of limitation. And I think that I'm worried also about this idea that the curator in Pavel's definition of framing that which resists the conventional definition of what a work of art might be over prescriptive. And I just wonder whether I wonder how you protect yourself and your collaborators from some of those types of problems. Do you see the kind of problem that
I'm not sure.
well, in that to be the person who provides the framework is to be the interpreter, which might be the interpreter before the fact rather than the after the fact. That there is a history of interpretation after the fact, which we kind of recognize from a safe distance once the art has been seen, done and dusted. The review, the critique, the art history book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in how, in a way, I'm talking in the context of a small organisation, how the projects can actually start to shape and build the organisation, take it forwards. So there's a kind of process of learning and constantly kind of thinking forwards, in a way, thinking through the work and allowing that to shape what the organisation is, rather than the other way around, which is quite often when institutions have a very clearly defined framework that then everything gets sort of put into and framed through the institution. I quite like the idea that some of the projects that we've been doing are certainly starting to shape what the showroom is.
Can you pinpoint that?
I mean, it's difficult to talk without examples, but most fresh in my mind is the project we just did with Can Altay, a Istanbul-based artist, where he drew on a lot of research we'd already done into the neighbourhood, because we very recently moved there and we've made a lot of connections within the neighbourhood. And he proposed to use the exhibition space as a kind of editorial space to produce a newspaper, which was sort of leading out from the area but not limited to it. So drawing out from different local news, let's say, or stories, in order to kind of talk about broader issues about, it's an area which is quite particular. It's going under, it's one of the poorest neighbourhoods in the wards in the country. It's sort of targeted for a regeneration, and so there's various kind of issues at stake in the neighbourhood which connected to things that Jan is interested in. So through his work and through doing this newspaper, we actually started to really develop various relationships within the neighbourhood with different kind of organised, some of them we'd formed already, but the newspaper kind of took it forwards. We put out an open call for writers, and we met quite a few people through that, and I think it had a really productive, it was a really productive thing to do for us as an organisation, because it kind of started to, develop things for us in terms of our local work. Not every project we do is so specifically kind of addressing our position in the neighbourhood and our relationships there, but there are quite a few things we are doing like that in our kind of program of participatory work. And
would you say that kind of reciprocal or generative kind of approach to curation is the exception rather than the rule? I think all too often there's a pressure on curators to reinvent the wheel, and when we talk about frameworks, to impose some kind of conceit, in the way that you were saying, prior to you have this idea, after there's a fashionable philosophy that it corresponds to, and so the artworks end up being servicing or being tools in the service of the idea, and in a way it's kind of there's a pressure to do that as a curator. Do you ever feel?
I mean, my approach has always been to draw from practice in a way, to kind of draw out from what artists are doing. I mean, it's just the way that I work personally. I find that's always been the most kind of inspiring, productive way to work. But
I think that partly comes out of the freelance curator, so you don't get a build-up of conversation within one institution if you're always bringing in the freelance curator to reinvent the wheel, or to do something shocking or different or new.
But maybe the wheel does need to be reinvented every now and then. It hasn't been invented lately,
sure,
as
you need
Charlie Brown says. And but this is really interesting. This is exactly what I meant by the kind of, the designation of sort of non-art practices as art, and who is doing it, and why it should be done, and what it is for, and so on. I'll tell you another example of an exhibition I sort of curated. I'm making these rabbit ears, which means inverted quotes, quite sort of purposefully here. Exactly a year ago, I was asked by a small gallery in Manchester called Castlefield, which is an ex or former artist-run space. I will very briefly outline its history because it's relevant. It's one of the first in England of that type artist-run spaces. Basically, a space where a bunch of painters in the early 1970s, well, mid-1970s, Manchester, a studio group kind of felt, there's nowhere to show anything, so let's put together a gallery. And they had this kind of smart idea that they put together a program where they got the then young Bridget Riley or I can't remember now, but artists of that sort of sort to do a show once every 6 months, somebody like that, and for the rest of the time you simply had the painters who were painting upstairs showing their works, and it kind of worked fine, but after a while everybody gets tired with it and things change and sponsorship is needed and funding from the Arts Council comes into it. And before you know, it becomes this kind of gallery that never really quite can bring itself to show a painting or anything that would, either remotely remind you of the kind of things that you thought you knew as art or would be any good for that matter.
It's not unlike Chisenhale, probably.
Sorry?
It's a bit like the Chisenhale situation.
Maybe.
Story.
And they approached me and asked me would I curate an exhibition there. And I said I would not do that thing. Not that I have a problem with curating, but basically it didn't kind of feel like the thing for me because I kind of sensed what they had in mind. And they said, well, would you do something else? And I said, well, what else would you expect me to do? And they said, anything. You can use the gallery any way you like. And so I said, look, here's an idea for you. We will use it as an art gallery. And you would not believe what this kind of tremor of shock. What an idea. Until now, I think. I hope. Are you here? No. Till now, it seems to be one of these kind of, in the gallery's own, if you like, way of looking at things, which I do not question, is their way of looking at things, is the kind of thing they do and that they believe in. It seems to be one of these successful projects. And what did I do there as a curator? I got few friends of mine whose work I really like a lot. I had a very good look at some paintings and some bits of sculpture, and those I liked, I just brought over. Yeah? And everybody kind of, it's classed, maybe not the most successful project in the history of the gallery, but just as successful as all the publishing things, all the times when the gallery was turned into a bar or a storage room or a discussion thing or anything. And it's really quite interesting that now I'm beginning to, in my head, getting into some shape this kind of question, what we need curators for. Maybe one thing we kind of need them for is to extend, if you like, the kind of function of the gallery and the opportunities that it provides, for better or worse, beyond what an artist can do. Whether that is a good news or not, I don't know. But I think that's somehow how.
What do you think is beyond what an artist?
Beyond what an artist. Well, in some kind of way, the artist cannot help, but artists don't make art. Artists make things that you encounter and develop or establish a relationship with, which we call art. Yeah? Artists make the kind of catalyst for it or the excuse for it. It seems to me, in my experience of the kind of curating I think most of us are thinking about, that this is not necessarily the case. That the curator does not have the obligation to put the viewer in a situation where kind of art happens. But the curator uses the privileges of the art. I mean, let's face it, Roland Barthes, culture is allowed to flourish as long as it repeatedly declares the vanity of its aims. We have this sort of space where we can do loads of things because somehow it's generally understood that they are without consequence. So we can be, radical, we can be political, we can come up with amazing ideas because we sort of know that being art, or at least being aired within the art space, almost by definition, they have no effect sort of outside that space, or the effect is not immediate or short-term or dramatic or whatever. And so, there are certain sort of possibilities that can be explored. Now, artists cannot quite explore them because artists have the obligation to produce the aesthetic effect.
Can I throw that to Penelope? Because you're the one who does have those paintings and sculptures and has an obligation. And it's more than that, because they're not just any paintings and sculptures. They're kind of the ones that belong to all of us. They're the ones that exist in our kind of collective consciousness, and we have some sort of sense of ownership of them. And if we follow Pavel's suggestion that it may be that perhaps the curatorial that has evolved over the past couple of decades has thrown the baby out with the bathwater. That we end up functioning, our role as curators would seem to be to sort of stabilize a discourse that sort of just doesn't necessarily look like art. But you've got a lot of art that looks like art in your place.
Well, I think there is a split between the collection and the business of curating, and I think that's really unfortunate. And also, I don't think that curating is a discipline, but whatever it is, it's become nearly exclusively connected with the contemporary. And I find that strange, that curating courses, which as you say are very common, are not curating historical art.
No.
And I don't understand why, because that probably needs it more than anything.
Right.
And there aren't artists to speak up there for their works. And there's so much material that is kind of left unspoken for. And you can do more. You can do a lot more experimental things, I think. And actually you can probably be more creative as a curator with historical art than you can with contemporary art. So, and very often curators make their name by being a kind of chaperone or trusted friend of given artists. And the more famous the artists, the more famous the curators. But if they moved away a little from contemporary art and contemporary artists and started to curate the mass of stuff we have in this country from an earlier period, I think that would be quite healthy. Right. And I think that could be a way within the Art Museum for the activity of curating, which is a contemporary activity, to come together with the historic collections.
I think that's a very interesting point where we should open it out. Time's not on our side, but we do have maybe a quarter of an hour for some questions.
I mean, art historians are historians. They just simply, use different material and look at kind of, or construct their image of the past from kind of different components that a historian of science or a historian of something else. And so I think whilst there is an overlap, and I think curators should use sort of art, should sort of, be committed to study of art history and should use art history as an instrument. I don't really think it's the same thing at all.
And just anecdotally, I mean, one of the things that I noticed in the formulation of curatorial programs, particularly in this country, that absolutely there was a very determined gesture to take art history out of the equation. And I include myself in this. And I ideologically stood there at Goldsmiths and said, I do not want curating to be in art history. I want it to be in the art department. Because I saw curating as practice. But there's a price that you pay for that, and I recognize that. And I think that having taken that ideological position, and I think it was the right decision, by the way, slowly something creeps up on you. And one of the things that you realize is that we did let go of our relationship to objects. We let go of our responsibility towards works of art. And it's a very strange thing to recognize in yourself when you fought a very particular ideological battle, and then it comes back to sort of bite you where it hurts. And I think that one of the things that I'm observing in terms of how our program is evolving is that our students and the people who teach on the program are becoming more conscious of a relationship to collections. Of course, there are many more collections now than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, so that's a whole other story as well. But it's a certain rapprochement with art history that I never anticipated at all. And I think we just recognized that I think we went too far in a particular gesture that we made to establish a kind of autonomy for the curator. And then when you get that autonomy, oh God, what we're going to do with it? And then we get nostalgic and we start to miss those things that we dearly, that we value. After all, that's sort of why we're here with, and so I kind of hold my hands up and sort of say, I think we're absolutely guilty of some of the things that you're suggesting. And I think slowly, there's a slow remedy for it. Nowhere near there yet. But it'd be interesting. I kind of think that's one of the ways that curating programs are going to change in the next 5 years. Over there. I'm sorry, forgive me for pointing in a rude way, but...
Thank you. Is it possible that there's an economic reason for why the curatorial seems to be bound up with contemporary art, in that the role of the curator as we kind of understand it now seems to have been largely born during the last economic boom, which was a kind of contemporary art boom, perhaps, and the curator seems to have come to fulfill an economic function there in creating value, in the process of subscription, where you sign up to call something art and to call it valuable, and that is kind of financially really central to contemporary art in a more direct way, perhaps, than to historical art, where some sort of value has already been established. Is that something to do with it, perhaps?
Yeah. That the contemporary curator as market maker, taste maker, in the biggest of the markets. So I think what you might be suggesting is to, market forces do come to play, and I suspect the contemporary art is probably the most dominant in that regard. But in relation to this, I guess we're in a contemporary art institution today, But for example, Penelope, you've got to look after 500 years of art. And how do you balance that in terms of, because I guess that what I have a vision of a lot of curators coming knocking at your door with special sort of particular pleas for a certain bit of funding or a certain project or a bit of space in the museum or an acquisition or etc. etc. Does contemporary art bully everybody else out of the way?
A little bit. I suppose it's not. I don't really have a problem with the curatorial as we're talking about it now, in the sense we know. But I just think it ought to take a wider terrain, really, and not in the sense of kind of like a parasite jumping into the Science Museum or the Natural History Museum. That I don't mean that at all. I mean a wider terrain in art, but also I think you're right in terms of the art history. I think the loss of knowledge is a problem, and I think with curating, you don't really need to train to be a curator. It's a practical intelligence, but and sometimes you can be in a position of strength to be ignorant, and that can be the artist or the curator. And working with a topic that you don't know well can give you a fresh way of thinking about it. But I do think at the moment the curator is the curator who works in the contemporary field, working with whatever they fancy, is strangely ignorant. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it's a very odd position to be in. It's about almost kind of not knowing, especially when you have these kind of museological projects by contemporary curators. It's somehow about a kind of absence of knowledge. Sorry, I'm not making much sense. Sorry.
No, it makes a lot of sense. A bit scary, but it makes a lot of sense. Another question. Over here.
Hi. Penelope was discussing the issues with curation being profoundly associated with the contemporary and with the now. But I've been reading a lot about the crisis of curation with the arrival of artists playing with the internet and new media, and that there's a crisis and that curators as such are finding it difficult to be involved in this field of artwork. And it made me perhaps want to ask you all the future of curation. Like, curation is very much a trend now, and it's something that everyone wants to be involved in, but will it be kind of like artists? Like, will curators be lost in a sea of curators? What do you think the future of curation is?
I mean, I think curating follows art practice. So, very often it's responding to what artists are doing. So I think in that sense, I don't think it's the curators who are necessarily kind of paving the way. I think it's a kind of more responsive thing.
I think it's early days. I really suspect that we haven't yet formulated fully what curatorial discourses there can be. We've been given the permission to do so. You know, the institutions have now said it's all right. I work in a university, very liberal university, and the great thing about art schools is, of course, there's this infinite capacity to. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can't do in an art school. There's nothing you can't say in an art school. Give or take a bit of health and safety.
Where have you been, Andy?
Up to a point.
But the institutions say it's all right because they make money from it.
But this is the point. I mean, and it's the institutional way of disarming those rather problematic statements. but I suspect that the languages of curating are yet to be fully formed. And I think Emily's correct in the sense that curating follows art. It does not say, right, I want some artists now who are going to make blue paintings or something. It's reactive, potentially in an interesting way. But I don't see that if there's a crisis, it's a crisis in terms of definition of terms, but there's an awful lot of people who want to be in this conversation. We haven't figured out how to do it. We haven't figured out even how to define it, which is really interesting, a generation on or two generations on.
I think we do know how to define it. It's just that the word isn't, we can define the word, which has a meaning,
yes,
but it's not the meaning that's now applied to the activity.
It's the activity that we're, I'm thinking in terms of two things. One, in terms of the activity, which I think none of us in this room would agree on what that particular activity is, but also in terms of how we explore it in a kind of more rigorous way. Because if, I take the view that kind of curating is practice, but on the other hand, I want to understand what research can be done in the name of curating. It's not necessarily the same kind of scholarship that Penelope's talking about in terms of her institution, but I think there is a job to be done. But I think it's not yet a stable one, and I guess when it becomes a stable one, it will become rather an uninteresting one as well. That would be my instinct.
But when you say, Emily, that curating follows practice, I'm not quite sure that it is that simple. It does follow something that sort of comes before that. But isn't it the case that to a great extent, I can think of numerous examples, that it does become a kind of little bit self-perpetuating, little bit kind of self-fulfilling thing. So it follows practice, but it follows practice which is already, if you like, contaminated by sort of that idea of doing things to order and so on. Surely before we had this sort of post-Harald Zeeman idea of exhibition making, which is, I assume, what we really are talking about here today. The idea that, somebody would come and, if you like, select a bunch of artists and more or less sort of tell them, come over and have a look at my space and tell me what you want to do in it, would have been very strange, because it's not merely that work used to be produced in the studio and then when it was sort of ready, or when the dealer or the curator kind of thought it was ready, it was kind of taken out and it's no longer your business and I show it to somebody. It is that the practices themselves have often, or artists have often sort of diverted or modified their practices to suit these forms of these opportunities and these forms of presentation and so on. Sometimes when I look at a place like Manchester, where it has become really the kind of thing to do for most of the younger or independent small institutions and galleries, to create these kinds of opportunities, you just feel, well, maybe the reason why there are no professional mid-career artists in Manchester is that there are too many opportunities, is the last thing you want. How about coming and have a look at this that I just made? Oh, that's jolly good. I put you in my next show, leave that behind and sort of do something with this, It does follow from something, but I'm not quite sure that when you say it follows from practice, that we could safely say that somehow the practice is something that exists sort of regardless, if you like, of that sort of other thing.
I think we have time for one last question. Over here. The white jumper.
I actually have a question for the artists/curators. This gentleman on the right, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. I didn't hear when you were introduced. Steven. You said that at times artworks become tools in the service of an idea. And as an artist, actually more so as an artist, I'd like you to answer this question: have you ever been in a situation whereby a curator has taken an artwork of yours and attributed meaning to it in a manner that you didn't necessarily agree with, or even if you did agree with, attributed meaning to it that you hadn't initially intended? And I guess the question is, for me, is that do you feel that curators often drive meaning, or do they illuminate it? I mean, what are they meant to do? Do they drive meaning? I mean, do they create meaning? Or do they somehow illuminate it through a series of artworks?
The last
Illuminate.
illuminate.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I think it's only natural that there's going to be an agenda that kind of sets itself, and the artwork is I suppose a repository. Like you said, the artwork is the encounter. The work in the work of art is the encounter between the object and the thing. And so, regardless, really, of what I have in mind, that it's that encounter which is the important part. That's the business end of the work of art, or at least the work of art is that encounter. It's interesting.
You can actually, you can almost sort of use it as a measure of, to use a dangerous word, of quality in the work of art or the performance of the work. My intentions as an artist are totally irrelevant to you as a viewer. And indeed, they should be to some extent sort of not very, or not necessarily, I would not necessarily expect a curator to know them or respect them. They usually ask, well, what were you trying to do? And you just say, well, you work it out, what are you trying to do? For a simple reason, that I have to have enough trust in what I do to somehow rely, or at least hope for, the capacity of the work to act as a focus for the production of meaning in the encounter with the audience, and to perform good works, yeah, and to perform regardless. So
Regardless of what we have in mind, what the curator might be pushing onto it. It's still, if it operates, then it operates. And yes, I think curators do sometimes force an agenda, but I don't necessarily think that's the massive problem. Sorry.
that is not a problem, yes. I think if there is a problem, for me anyway, I would sum it up like this. One way to kind of think where this idea of curating, if we are agreed on what we are talking about, which I'm not sure we are, but just intuitively, one way of thinking where this idea of curating might come from is to look at the kind of history in modern Western art of things like collage, assemblage, installation, and so on, which are by no means a kind of ancient methodologies in art. They have a particular kind of pedigree and origins and chronology and so on. And in one way or another, you can see throughout the history of the last, let's say, 100 years or a little bit less, how they are becoming a kind of almost dominant, or at least very prominent, ways of producing the aesthetic effect. You know, you take pre-existent sort of bits and pieces as an artist and sort of put them together or display them somehow and mix them and stick them on top of each other and so on, rather than kind of beginning from the scratch. And it seems to me that what we call curating, and I've even heard terms like critical curating or even creative curating. I don't know if that is sort of something you have in your curriculum, but
the first thing I did was take the word creative out.
Good.
Be
Good.
institution.
Anyway, and but it seems to me that what we call curating is somehow a kind of variant of this, but it's with a different agenda and with a different purpose, perhaps, that the person is taking these bits and pieces and kind of collaging them together into something slightly different, but it's the same bits.
I think that's a fantastic, if chastening way to end this discussion.
And what's the trouble with curating? What's the trouble?
We don't know what the hell it is. That's the trouble.
It's quarter past 8, and we still don't know.
My brother nearly
That would seem to be the trouble.
Is there a
the
trouble?
trouble.
Is there too much, too little? Not good enough?
I'm suspecting there may be too much.
What is the trouble?
Let's hope it's too much of a good thing.
I hope we've inched a little bit closer to a series of definitions rather than a single definition. And I hope at least there's been a little bit food for thought. But I think, for my part, it's been a real honour to be with Penelope, Emily, Pavel, and Steven, and really on their behalf, on your behalf, I thank them very much indeed. Thank you.
Their behalf.